James watched the coffee until I picked up the cup. Steam moved between us across the kitchen island. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him, and the apartment still smelled like the garlic bread he had burned earlier. While reheating dinner, he looked tired in the way doctors often do after long shifts, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from the shower, calm face hiding exhaustion. He asked whether my headache felt any better tonight. I told him yes. Then I drank the coffee while the white powder collected quietly at the bottom of the cup. At that point, I still wanted to believe there was another explanation. 3 months earlier, I would not have questioned anything James gave me. Most people trusted him immediately. Patients at St. Vincent asked for him by name. Hospital staff straightened slightly when he walked through hallways. Even outside work, strangers listened carefully when he spoke, as if his voice carried its own authority. When I met him, I understood why. The fundraiser where we met was loud and forgettable. Cheap wine, crowded tables, people pretending to enjoy networking conversations. I spent most of the evening near the back wall, wishing I had stayed home. Then James sat beside me and asked what I was reading. Not what I did for work, not where I lived, what I was reading. A week later, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a first edition of the novel I mentioned that night, along with a note apologizing for the coffee stain on page 42, because he had bought it secondhand from an old bookstore downtown. Nobody had ever remembered details about me that carefully before. That was probably the beginning. After we married, we moved into James's apartment near Riverside Avenue. The place overlooked the river, though most nights we forgot to open the curtains because he came home so late from the hospital. Still, the apartment slowly became ours instead of his. My shoes near the entrance, my books stacked beside the sofa, my tea beside his expensive coffee beans. At night, James often fell asleep reading medical journals with his glasses sliding down his nose. Sometimes I removed them carefully so they would not break while he slept. Those memories complicated everything later. The headaches began near the end of winter. Nothing dramatic at first. Long afternoons at work started leaving me exhausted. Bright screens hurt my eyes. One morning, I forgot the password I had typed every day for almost 2 years and stared at my computer while coworkers waited behind me. Another afternoon, I boiled water for tea and forgot about it until smoke reached the living room. James noticed the changes before I did. He started asking small questions during dinner, whether I was sleeping properly, whether the headaches stayed in one place or moved behind my eyes, whether I felt tired before work or only afterward. At the time, his attention felt comforting. Stress affects people physically more than they expect. Lack of sleep changes concentration. Anxiety affects memory. When exhaustion builds slowly, people adapt to feeling unwell without realizing how far they have drifted from normal. James explained these things calmly while cooking pasta one evening, and I remember feeling grateful that someone understood what was happening to me. A few days later, he brought home medication from the hospital pharmacy. The pills came inside folded paper packets with handwritten instructions across the front. One for migraines, one to help me sleep, another for anxiety because James believed stress was making everything worse. Every evening, he placed them beside my plate before dinner. At first, the changes felt helpful. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The headaches became dull instead of sharp. My body stopped feeling constantly tense. Then other things started happening. Simple tasks began taking longer than usual. I reread emails 3 or 4 times before understanding them. Some mornings, I entered rooms and forgot why I was there. During meetings at work, Conversations occasionally sounded distant, as if people were speaking from another part of the building. The strangest part was how normal that started feeling. The human mind adjusts quickly. People living beside train tracks eventually stop hearing trains. People under constant stress stop recognizing exhaustion. Slowly, your worst days begin feeling ordinary. One evening, I burned my wrist on the oven tray because I forgot I was holding it. James took my hand immediately and ran cold water over the skin while asking why I had not been more careful. I remember feeling embarrassed, almost guilty. A week later, he suggested I take time away from work. I resisted at first. Publishing was not exciting, but I liked structure, deadlines, morning trains, familiar routines. James listened quietly while I explained all of this, then asked me one question. How could I recover if I never rested? It sounded reasonable, so I resigned. After that, the apartment became strangely quiet during the day. James left before sunrise most mornings. I stayed behind with half-read books and television episodes I could not follow properly anymore. Some afternoons disappeared completely because I slept without planning to. Other days, I sat near the living room windows watching people cross the street below, while hours passed unnoticed. Time became difficult to measure. Without routines, days begin blending together. Breakfast happens later. Sleep becomes irregular. Conversations disappear. People often underestimate how quickly isolation affects the mind. One Thursday night, I woke up and realized James was not beside me. The digital clock near the bed read 12:43. At first, I thought he was still working in the hospital. But then I saw light beneath his office door across the hallway. I walked toward it slowly. The apartment was silent except for the low sound of James speaking. At first, I assumed he was on the phone with another doctor. Then I heard my name. I stopped moving. James continued speaking in the same calm voice he used at work. Words drifted through the door in pieces: dosage, dependency, behavioral response. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood what I was hearing. Then the office became quiet. A chair moved softly across the floor. The door opened. James stood there holding a recorder in one hand. Neither of us spoke immediately. He looked more annoyed than surprised. After a few seconds, he asked why I was awake. I told him I could not sleep. His eyes stayed on my face another moment before he stepped around me toward the kitchen. A minute later, I heard water running from the sink. The next morning, he acted exactly the same as always. That unsettled me more than anger would have. Around noon, while James was still at the hospital, I searched the bathroom cabinet for my medication. Most packets only had dates written across them. No labels, no pharmacy information. Inside the bottom drawer, I found a prescription bottle with black marker scraped roughly across the original name. Underneath it was mine. Katherine Hale. I opened the bottle and tipped one tablet into my palm. It looked identical to the pills James gave me every evening. An hour later, I carried it into a pharmacy 6 blocks away from our building. The pharmacist was an older woman with silver glasses hanging low across her nose. She examined the pill beneath the counterlight for several seconds without speaking. Then she asked where I got it. I told her. My husband brought it home from the hospital. She looked up immediately. Her expression changed in a way I still remember clearly. Not shock, recognition. She asked how often I was taking the medication. I said every night. The pharmacist became quiet for a moment, before explaining that the drug was normally used only in controlled psychiatric treatment and short-term sedation. Extended use could affect concentration, memory, emotional stability, and coordination. While she spoke, I kept thinking about the forgotten passwords, the sleeping afternoons, the smoke filling the kitchen while water boiled dry on the stove. I asked whether the medication could explain confusion. She said yes. Then she asked the question I could not answer: who exactly prescribed this to you? Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. I left the pharmacy without answering her. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sidewalk still reflected the gray afternoon light. People moved around me, carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, talking into phones, stepping around puddles without looking down. Everything felt painfully normal. I stood beside the crosswalk, trying to remember the last few months clearly. Some memories came back sharply. Others felt blurred around the edges, like photographs left too long in sunlight. James standing beside the stove, crushing tablets with the back of a spoon because he said they worked faster that way. James reminding me to finish my tea before it became cold. James asking the same questions every evening in the same calm voice. How was your headache today? Did you sleep this afternoon? Any dizziness? At the time, I thought he was worried about me. Now the questions sounded different in my head. By the time I reached our apartment building, my hands had stopped shaking. Fear was still there, but something else had replaced the confusion that usually surrounded it. For the first time in months, my thoughts felt connected from beginning to end. That scared me too. Inside the apartment, everything looked untouched. My sweater still hung over the dining chair from breakfast. James's coffee mug sat beside the sink with a pale brown line dried around the inside. The dishwasher hum softly in the kitchen. I locked the front door without thinking. Then I went directly to James's office. The room smelled faintly of paper and antiseptic. Medical journals covered most of the shelves, organized with the kind of precision that made the space feel more professional than personal. James hated disorder. Even his desk drawers closed silently. I searched carefully at first. Tax papers, hospital schedules, research articles. Nothing unusual. Then I opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a dark leather notebook pressed flat beneath several patient files. I almost missed it completely. The first pages looked ordinary. Surgery notes, appointment reminders, medication references written in James's narrow handwriting. Halfway through the notebook, the entries changed. The dates remained, but the tone became colder, more observational. Katherine showing improved compliance after dosage increase. Mild memory fragmentation now, consistent during evening conversations. Subject displays reduced resistance when isolated from workplace structure. I read the sentences twice before understanding them properly. Subject, not wife, not Katherine. Subject. A strange feeling moved through me then, not panic exactly, but distance. Like I was reading about another woman who happened to have my name. There were more entries beneath it. Emotional dependency on primary caregiver remains stable. Recommendation. Continue controlled exposure. One page farther in, I found notes describing my sleeping patterns in hourly detail. I stopped turning pages after that. The sound of keys at the apartment door froze me immediately. James was home. I shoved the notebook back into the drawer so quickly that one corner bent beneath the files. A second later, I heard his footsteps crossing the hallway. Katherine? His voice sounded normal, warm. I walked into the kitchen before he reached the office. James entered carrying paper bags from the Italian restaurant near the hospital. He smiled when he saw me standing by the counter, but his eyes paused on my face a second too long. "You look tired," he said. I told him I probably needed more sleep. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then James placed the food containers on the counter and started unpacking them while talking about a surgery from earlier that day. His tone stayed relaxed, but I noticed things I had ignored before: how carefully he watched whether I ate, how often his attention returned to my hands, how quickly he noticed changes in my mood. At dinner, I barely touched the pasta. James asked if my stomach hurt again, like it had happened before. I suddenly realized there were entire conversations from the past few months I could not fully remember anymore. That frightened me more than the notebook. Memory loss does not only remove information, it damages confidence. People begin relying more heavily on others because their own thoughts stop feeling dependable. Over time, control can start looking almost identical to care. James stood from the table after dinner and returned a minute later holding 2 folded paper packets and a glass of water. Same routine, same calm expression. He placed the medication beside my plate. I stared at the packets long enough for him to notice. "You forgot yesterday too," he said quietly. Yesterday? My chest tightened. I had no memory of forgetting anything. James sat back down slowly, still watching me. "You've been more distracted recently," he continued. "That usually happens before the headaches get worse." The terrifying part was how reasonable he sounded. I picked up the pills with steady fingers and lifted the glass to my mouth. James continued eating while I pretended to swallow. The tablet stayed hidden beneath my tongue until later that night. Around 1 in the morning, I locked myself inside the bathroom and dropped them into the toilet. For a long moment, I stood there staring at my reflection above the sink. I looked older than I remembered. Not physically older exactly, just worn down in a way I had never noticed before. My face had become thinner over the past few months. Dark circles shadowed the skin beneath my eyes. Even my posture looked different, slightly uncertain, like someone expecting bad news before it arrived. I touched the edge of the sink to steady myself. Then another thought entered my mind slowly enough to feel worse than panic. If the medication had been affecting me this badly, James would eventually notice when it stopped. The next morning, James noticed the difference before I spoke a single word. I saw it while he poured coffee into his travel mug. His attention stayed on me too long, almost measuring something. Usually, mornings passed quietly between us. James read hospital emails at the counter while I struggled through the heavy fog that had become normal over the past few months. That fog was thinner now, dangerously thinner. "You're awake early," he said. I told him I could not sleep. James leaned back against the counter, holding his coffee. His expression remained relaxed, but I noticed a small pause before his next question. "Did you take the medication last night?" The sink faucet dripped softly between us. I answered yes without hesitation. For a second, his eyes stayed fixed on my face. Then he nodded once and reached for his coat. The moment the apartment door closed behind him, I returned to the bathroom and stared at the remaining paper packets inside the cabinet drawer. There were dozens of them arranged neatly by date. Some went back nearly 5 months. I opened one carefully. Inside were 3 different tablets. James had told me they were for migraines, anxiety, and sleep problems. But now I realized something strange. None of the packets looked exactly the same. Some had larger doses, others contained pills with different markings entirely. He had been adjusting them, testing them. The thought made my skin feel cold. I carried the packets into the living room and spread them across the coffee table beside my phone. For nearly an hour, I searched medical databases and pharmaceutical websites, trying to identify the markings printed across each tablet. Most belonged to sedatives. Others treated psychiatric disorders. One medication was usually prescribed only for severe paranoia and psychotic episodes. I stopped reading after that. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. I stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Riverside Avenue. Below, traffic moved through the wet streets while pedestrians crossed intersections wrapped in scarves and dark coats. Watching ordinary people continue, their mornings felt strangely unreal. Nobody looking up at our building would imagine what was happening inside it. Abuse rarely resembles what people expect. Control often arrives disguised as care, especially when the person causing harm understands exactly how trust works. The most dangerous manipulation does not feel violent in the beginning. It feels protective. Around noon, my phone rang unexpectedly. The number belonged to St. Vincent Medical Center. For one irrational second, I almost answered immediately like nothing had changed. Then I let it ring twice before picking up. A woman from the neurology department asked whether James had left an important patient file at home by mistake. She sounded distracted and apologized for bothering me. I told her I would check his office. The moment the call ended, I walked back into that room with a different kind of fear pressing against my chest. Until then, part of me still wanted another explanation. Stress, medical research, professional detachment, anything except the truth forming slowly in front of me. I searched the office more aggressively this time. Desk drawers, locked cabinets, storage boxes beneath the shelves. Then, inside the second filing cabinet, I found a thick folder labeled only with my initials, KH. My hands became unsteady before I even opened it. Inside were printed reports describing mood changes, emotional reactions, sleeping behavior, appetite patterns, and dosage responses. Some pages included dates beside handwritten notes in James's narrow script. Increased dependency after workplace resignation. Subject responds positively to reassurance following confusion episodes. Memory disruption, now sufficient to influence self-perception. At the bottom of one page, clipped beneath several reports, sat a hospital consent form. My name appeared near the signature line, but I had never signed it. I knew immediately because the handwriting looked almost correct, while still feeling wrong, like someone copying familiar movements slowly. Below the signature was the title of a neurological behavioral study connected to St. Vincent. I stopped breathing for a moment. James had not only been medicating me, he had been documenting me, using me. A sudden sound behind me made my entire body lock in place. The apartment door opened. I checked the clock instinctively. Too early. James's footsteps crossed the hallway before I could close the cabinet properly. Papers slipped from my hands onto the floor just as his shadow appeared across the office doorway. Neither of us spoke. James looked at the open folder first, then at me. Something changed in his expression then. Not anger exactly, more like disappointment, quiet disappointment. He stepped inside the office and closed the door behind him. I told the hospital not to call here, he said calmly. I backed away from the filing cabinet without realizing it. James noticed immediately. His eyes moved briefly toward the scattered papers near my feet, then back to my face. You stopped taking them, he said softly. It was not a question. Outside, somewhere far below the apartment windows, a car horn echoed through the street. The sound felt distant, disconnected from the silence inside the room. James took one slow step closer, and for the first time since I met him, I realized he was no longer pretending to be my husband. If this story kept you thinking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, and tell me honestly, would you have trusted James for this long?